Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to an EAS Consulting Group webinar on 510K regulations presented by EAS Independent Consultant John Lincoln. EAS is a member of the certified group of companies and is a global leader in regulatory solutions for industries regulated by FDA. Our network of over 200 independent advisors and consultants enables EAS to provide comprehensive consulting, training, and auditing services, ensuring proactive regulatory compliance. From strategic product development, preparation of technical submissions, including 510Ks, or assistance with Form 483s or warning letters, EAS offers the detailed knowledge and experience your company requires. Today, our presenter is John Lincoln. John assists medical device companies with production and validation issues and preparation for 510K submissions to FDA. Additionally, he supports medical device product risk management efforts, conducts trainings, and contributes to publications such as RAPs on verification and validation processes. John has compiled many 510Ks, IDEs, and assists software development teams in compiling documentation necessary to obtain an IDE. During the webinar today, you may ask any questions of John by typing them into either the chat or the Q&A box. And with that, I will get our slides over to full screen. John, is that full screen for you?
Yes, it is. Thanks, Amy.
Okay, great. And then I will give you remote control and mute my microphone and you'll be all set.
Okay. Well, we'd like to welcome all of you to this presentation dealing with the 510K and some of the more novel or modified pathways as alternatives based on safety issues or breakthrough technology issues. So I don't know how many of you have been involved in 510Ks or are familiar with them, but we're going to discuss a little bit of the 510K, the various desires on the part of the FDA to modernize the program, to get away from predicate devices that are too old and don't reflect the latest technology, which does not benefit the use community, the patient community. So first of all, we're going to look at, let's see if I get the right, okay. The FDA's methodology for bringing products to market, basically, if you have class 1 device, now the classifications are based on law, 21 CFR, the 800 series of law. You'll have to find your family of products there. If you can't, then your product is a class 3 and it's a PMA, and we'll talk about that. The classifications that the US uses is based on 21 CFR, Code of Federal Regulation, law. Classifications in Europe are based on the medical device regulation and annex, and the various rules in the annex dealing with risk. The FDA's classification is also dealing with risk, but they have predetermined that. With the medical device directive or regulation in Europe, you work with your notified body to determine the classification based on the rules that are stated in the medical device regulation. So the big difference between the two. So we're going to be focused on the US FDA's methodology here because we're talking about basically the 510K methodology. Usually class 1 devices, very simple devices, tongue depressors and things like that, don't require a 510K. When you get into moderately risky devices that can have a downside, can cause injury or death, generally more injury, you're looking at class 2 type devices. In Europe, there's class 2A, 2B, but US class 2. And here, generally, that is handled by the 510K process. We'll mention the de novo in passing, but it's basically the 510K. Now, in most cases, the 510K does not require clinicals, but some 510Ks do, and I've worked with one that did, or was determined to require one on the part of the FDA when they started reviewing our submission. So that does happen. Now, when you're dealing with class 3 devices, those are devices you won't find listed in the 21 CFR 800. And so in most cases, they will be PMA. These are high-risk products. Almost always they require clinicals. They can take several years to get through the process, and they're extremely complex. And they're a little although some of the basic requirements of data are the same as the 510K, they will require a lot more data. And although the FDA is slowly moving away to taking in non-clinical journal articles as a consideration, right now they're focused on the need for clinicals. With the 510K, in most cases, there's no clinical requirement. With the 510K, it's called a pre-market notification. And with the PMA, that's pre-market approval. So when you hear about approved products, the formal definition of approval is the PMA. If you're talking about notification, it's cleared. A 510K clears your product to market. The PMA approves your product to market. So a little definition there that we need to be aware of. I see those terms misused in marketing. Generally, the FDA does not like you to even mention that kind of thing in your marketing. Getting into the specifics, implying that they basically have ruled your product defect free or problem free, which they don't want to do. So as I mentioned, class 1 means you have to meet the GMPs. You have to manufacture the product under the current good manufacturing practices. And for devices, that's 820, 21 Code of Federal Regulation 820. There can be exceptions or exemptions, and there may or may not be. That will be listed in the 800 series that applies to your family of product. Class 2, that's general controls. That means they were manufactured under the CGMPs, and then some special controls that may require adherence to a standard or something else required. And there may occasionally be clinicals involved, and can be exemptions with or without. Class 3, that's general controls with pre-market approval, which is a more full of review of the agency, or heavy involvement in your entire production process, extensive clinicals. Another difference between Europe and US, when you're dealing with a 510K, you submit a lot of information about the product, and then they review that, they may request additional information, and finally they clear it, then you can go to market with the product. Later on, maybe a year or two later, they'll show up at your door and do a compliance inspection. In Europe, you have to go through all the certifications and inspections before you go to market, before you're going to fix the CE mark. You have to have a compliant quality management system for devices. That's ISO 13485. And you have to have your product authorized representatives in the countries in which you're selling the product, et cetera. And then you have your notified body inspect your quality management system, inspect your technical documentation, and inspect your manufacturing system, and if there's specific standards that you test to and things like that before you go to market. With the FDA, everything's based on your submission and the assumption you're manufacturing the product that ends up in the marketplace under the GMPs, including design control 820.30. I see that violated quite a bit with new companies, startup companies, small companies, where they frequently get the 510K, go to market, and they're not compliant to the GMPs, and they don't have a design history file. I know that because I get called in after the fact to resolve a warning letter or a 483 observation from an inspection on the part of the FDA where those items were missing. It's assumed that when you go to market based on a cleared 510K, you are compliant to the GMPs. For devices, 21 CFR 820. So once again, as is true of Europe, now bear in mind the US system predates European system in terms of quality, in terms of GMPs, all of those things. Started with the pharmaceuticals in the early 1900s, moved to the devices in the middle 1970s, and so on. And then, of course, later on in Europe, you had ISO 9000, and then ISO 9000 was tailored to devices, became ISO 13485. And then later on, 7.3 and 1345 basically copied 820.30 on design control, the 10 elements of design control. So the classification systems here are based on risk, basically, and use, and we'll talk about that as well as we go through this. Class 3, these are high-risk products. As I mentioned before, they do not have a predicate on the marketplace. Now, one of the modifications we're going to talk about later, the breakthrough devices and the STEP program, are designed to make the 510K program less tied specifically to predicates, although it is totally based on predicates, but it allows for breakthrough technology, for example. So iterations that improve the product without getting into a PMA. So it kind of expands the definition of substantially equivalent to allow for a little bit of improvement, not just proving your product is a copycat of something already out in the marketplace, but proving it's basically poses the same risks as something that is out in the marketplace, but may have some slight improvements upon it without getting to the point where you're into a PMA. And that's a subtle point. There's rooms for discussion and argument and disagreement between yourself and the agency on that. Of course, they have the final say. So the key point of a 510K basically is to show your product has the same safety and effectiveness issues as a predicate device on the marketplace, where the FDA can look at that predicate device, see its history, consider the types of problems it has already generated with the patient population, and view your new product against what is already out in the marketplace to see if there's any additional issues of safety and efficacy. But the assumption is your product is so much similar to the product already in the marketplace that there's no new issues of safety and efficacy. So that's the key purpose of a 510K. And the two technologies we're going to talk about in this discussion are the modifications to the 510K push the envelope of substantial equivalence, or SE, just a little bit to allow for more novel technologies. In the case of STEP, regarding safety issues. In the case of breakthrough technologies and major changes that don't change the product, but basically enhance the product and its ability to deal with high-risk situations that can cause injury or death. We'll get into the specifics of that later on. And all they do is they don't remove 510K or PMA requirements. If you were going to go to those routes, you'd go to that route. All those STEP program and breakthrough technology programs do is expedite the review on the part of the FDA, because you've done some preliminary work with the FDA beforehand, so they understand how you're developing your product, what the issues are regarding your product, and they're stepping in and having a little bit of background on your product when you finally submit the formal 510K or the PMA. So in most cases, the FDA would like you to see the 510K. And it's the least burdensome of the two approaches, obviously, as I mentioned earlier. Now, if you can't go the PMA, the technology is different enough that there's no substantial equivalence out there, and your device still does not pose serious health issues, safety issues to a patient, you can go the de novo route. That's kind of a low-level PMA, if you will. So that's an option. And of course, once a device is cleared under the de novo route or approved under the de novo route, it becomes a predicate device for a subsequent 510K. So class is based on use, its intended use or indications for use. Now, if you've been in the industry for any length of time, you know the FDA back in August of 2010 did a couple key studies, one on the 510K process and one on better science. And they looked at both their own operation and industry. Under their review of the 510K process, they found that even in their own staff, even though there's published definitions on their website and in their documentation, their own staff in the FDA did not always understand the clear difference between intended use and indications for use. Basically, intended use is the top level. What do you intend for the product to do in a very general sense? Indications for use get into specifics like the disease or condition it's intended to work with, to diagnose, treat, or prevent, cure, or mitigate. includes a description of the patient population, like a geriatric or neonatal or a general population or a specific race or whatever for intended. If you're submitting a 510K, you deal with indications for use. And that becomes a formal statement. If you go beyond those attended indications for use, like marketing tends to do, want to expand the sales of their product, you get into what is called off-label promotion, which is illegal. So you need to be careful. Once you get a cleared 510K, you're stuck to the indications for use. You can't expand it without a new 510K. You could contract it. In some cases, contraction even requires a new 510K. But indications for use from the FDA standpoint is a legal statement. One of your 21 tabs in your submission is the indications for use. They review that very carefully. And once they clear that, that's it. And that your marketing cannot exceed that. And that's where, again, I see violations, because once again, even in companies, they use indications for use with the small I and a small u as a noun rather than a pronoun. And that can get you into trouble. So bear in mind, that should be reflected in your labeling, should be reflected in your marketing, and that includes your information on the website, etc. So, and usually it's almost verbatim to a predicate device. The less that is verbatim, the more you're going to get pushback from the reviewer. And I base that on my own personal experience. But the main differentiation between class is risk, between class 1, 2, and 3, and the same is true over in Europe. So we're talking about risk based on patient risk. Here again, companies get in a lot of trouble because when they talk about risk-based, they include financial risk, scheduling risk, budget risks, etc. Those are real business risks, but they are not what the FDA talks about risk when they talk about risk. They're talking about with devices ISO 14971, the current version 2019. So that's what their risk. That's risk to the patient, risk to the user, like the clinician, and risk to the use environment. Nothing more. Companies have gotten warning letters, primarily overseas, but are shipping into the US because they take the broader definition of risk under ISO 31000. But we're talking about risk based on the definition in ISO 14971 to the patient, the clinician, and the use environment for that product. So class 1 is lowest, class 3 is the highest, class 2 is your 510K primarily. So your first step in getting involved in this process is determine the classification of your product. Ideally, you can find it under 21 CFR 800 series, and that'll tell you what it is, and that becomes your becomes the one part of the definition, the regulation number of your device. There's the product code also, and that is under the regulation. It'll tell you the product code, like MEB, BSP. Those acronyms have no bearing on their use other than they're tied to it. I had one FDA person years ago say it was based on initials of the initial person that handled that particular panel or product. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems to be the most reasonable definition for the acronyms that are used. They don't stand for the actual product that it is. They're connected to a specific product or class of products, but they don't seem, the acronym doesn't match the product, let's put it that way. So that could be confusing. So you have to go purely by the regulation number to tell you what the product code is. And then it will also, the regulation will tell you which device panel will be reviewing your product when you submit it under the 510K. As I mentioned, the medical device regulation overseas has a different classification program. We're not going to get into that, but just be aware of the difference, and I've covered it a little bit. The key purpose of a 510K is to prove your product is substantially equivalent to a product already in the marketplace. So this brings you to an issue. Sometimes you find a product that has a 510K number, a K number, a K in several digits, a year number, and then a sequential number, year of submission to the FDA. If some of those devices never made it to market. They may have gotten a clearance from the FDA, but they never made it to market for whatever reason. That is not a valid predicate. In the past, the FDA didn't really check a lot of that apparently, but now they do. And not only are they concerned with a K number that you might reference as your predicate, which is not in the marketplace, so it has no use history, or they're also concerned with those that are old, much older. Those of you who've been in industry for any length of time, and I have over 40 years in the industry, know that the 510Ks submitted in the 1980s, for example, maybe only a few pages long. That's certainly not true of the 510Ks submitted today. They can be 100 pages long or more, depending on the complexity, depending upon whether electronics, software, firmware are involved, that kind of a thing. And so the same goes for intended use. In the past, those indications for use were not highlighted. They might have been mentioned in a general narrative, and they're hard to find. But that's not true today. You have one of the tabs is specifically dealing with indications for use. So the FDA has steadily tightened up the definitions of the various requirements that go into a 510K. Now, that's the second from the bottom bullet point is a point that we're really stressing in this discussion today. You can expand the technology incrementally and still have a 510K. And the purpose for the STEP program and the Breakthrough Devices program is to push that even a little bit further and to eliminate the difficulty in the clearance process. I know I pushed the envelope one time on a needle which had multiple fenestrations on the shank or the cannula, as opposed to a normal needle with just a hole at the end. And we had data to show that this was a safer device than the existing needle for anesthesiology. But what happened was the FDA looked at it, refused to accept the 510K and told us we needed to do clinicals. We did a feasibility study, it came out flawless. The FDA wouldn't accept it. They wanted an additional phase 1 study, rolling out to 3 sites at least and 3 monitors, surgeons in this case. And that's what we had to do. So it pushed the 510K from 90 to 120 days all the way out to a couple of years before we were done with this, with various meetings. And this is before they had the STEP program and the Breakthrough Technology program, which would eliminate some of that because you're told up front what you need to do. And you work with the agency on that, and you come up with a strategy together. And so they're aware of each step of the way of where you're going, as opposed to what we found after the fact, so to speak. As I mentioned, indications for use is a subset of intended use, but it's indications for use that goes on your labeling, and it is one of the tabs that's required in the submission of your traditional 510K. So the FDA expects that when you're submitting a 510K, you're also already have or are in the process of getting an establishment registration number from the FDA. You're registering your establishment as a manufacturer or a specification developer with the agency. They're expecting that when you build your product, it's going to be compliant to the GMPs, the current good manufacturing practices. So if you're familiar with the GMPs for devices, that's 820. You know that you usually will not pass an FDA inspection just by virtue of adhering to the written GMPs. You're expected to be current. That you're expected to be where your industry is in general, in the middle of your industry. So you're expected to have validation master plans, even though that's not specifically called out in the GMPs. You're expected to have a quality manual in addition to your SOPs. That's not called out in the GMPs, and so on. So you need to be aware of what your industry is doing in general, not leading edge, not bleeding edge, but in general, to be fully compliant with the C in CGMPs. The GMPs 820 apply to those devices sold, marketed and sold in the United States. So it doesn't matter where they're manufactured, but if they're going to be sold in the US, they have to comply with the GMPs. There is a goal to harmonize the GMPs to Europe. And right now there's a attempt on a part of the FDA to once again revise 820 to match the format of 1345. In the past, they did that to try to match the format of 9000. They did, and then 9000 was changed into 1345, and the number of subparts were reduced to 8. So, and the FDA didn't change, but now they're getting around to changing. But there is still a disconnect, although there are some inspections that are supposed to be honored on both sides. In most cases, the FDA's GMP inspection is still tougher than a notified body inspection for the CE mark in Europe. And I base that on CAPA issues and, as I mentioned earlier, on risk. I've dealt with 2 companies recently that got warning letters from the FDA that were in Europe and Asia on this issue of risk because they were taking a broader view of it, and the FDA has a narrow patient risk issue. 510Ks are supposedly cleared within 90 days. I've had one clear in 30 days, and it was a traditional, not a special or abbreviated. But in most cases, it takes longer than that, usually 120 days or so. That's what I usually tell clients as well. And I gave you an example of one where the FDA required clinicals, and that drug out for a couple of years almost. PMAs can take a couple of years and cost considerably more because you're dealing with a lot of clinicals in most cases. Now, the FDA requires 1 hard copy, paper copy in a submission, and 1 electronic copy per a specified format that they outline on their website. And that's usually submitted by an old DVD or more likely a flash drive. During the course of the review, the FDA may call you with additional information. They'll stop the clock while you're trying to get that information submitted back. They may give you a deadline. In most cases, they will, maybe 180 days or so, and under which you have to get back that information to them. But again, that just may tend to drag the review out. Then as a result of their review, they either refuse to accept. That means you're missing something, and I'll give some examples later on. Or they might find not substantially equivalent, which means you've canceled everything, you've lost what you paid to make the submission, which is substantial. Or they may clear it, and so you use that K number as your justification for going to market with your product. If they say non-substantially equivalent, you may end up having to go the clinical route and still be a 510K. You may have to go the de novo route, or you may have to go to a pure PMA route, or you may just pull the whole product as being too costly or involved in with insufficient return. It's up to you. Okay, we'll get back to the traditional just near the conclusion, but I do want to emphasize the 2 key areas that the FDA has opened up to expedite novel technologies or safer technologies. And this is a result of a couple of statements by the then commissioner of the FDA. Basically, their goal was to get away from old predicate devices. That's maybe to your advantage as a company to pick an older device that's a little simpler to show substantial equivalence to, has a little more history as well. But the FDA wants to safely push the envelope a little bit to march device development forward rather than be stuck in a time warp, so to speak. And so as a result of that, the FDA has for years pushed substantially equivalent. Basically, their reviewers have basically say identical is the way they tend to interpret it. And whenever you start getting a little beyond identical, then you start getting all kinds of questions from a reviewer, especially a reviewer that's not familiar with your particular product that well. And some aren't. Some are part-timers, some are remote reviewers, even before there was the COVID problem. And you find different knowledge bases with the reviewers you're dealing with. So once again, the FDA wants to see improvement in devices. And they're using these 2 methodologies we'll be explaining in a little more detail to do just that. They call it predicate modernization. And so they want to see the predicates you're trying to copy and maybe even go a little bit beyond as the ones that are at the leading edge in the field already, not something that's 10 or 20-year-old technology. So as a result of that, they've done these two approaches that we'll be talking about. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these points right here. You notice here from 2015 to 2018, approximately 20% of the 510Ks that were cleared were based on substantial equivalence to a predicate device that was more than 10 years old. Well, that doesn't do any good for the field. Basically, you're just doing a me too. And they'd like to see you go a little bit beyond the me too without getting so far advanced that you're stuck going to a PMA route. Now, what I'm expressing here is the viewpoint of the centers like CDRH back in Silver Springs, Maryland. It is not always the viewpoint of the reviewer or a field inspector. They lag in terms of reflecting the thinking of the centers. That's been my experience. In fact, I tried to push the envelope recently on a case of a classification of a device having software in it and was shot down. But the purpose of the center's desire and the FDA's commissioner's desire, now we do have a new commissioner now, but so as far as I know, that hasn't changed what we're presenting here, is beneficial iteration. That's kind of quite interesting. So when you talk about substantial equivalence, you put an asterisk on a substantial equivalence, and the asterisk leads you to beneficial iteration. In other words, slight improvements, still under the 510K arrangement, that improves the product in terms of its effect on the situations dealing with the patient. So that's the point. Like you notice here, truly benefit patient. We're not talking about marketing improvements. There's a big difference between substantial equivalence and what marketing touts as the product you're rolling out. They're going to talk about everything being totally new, when in fact that's probably not true. It better not be totally true, although some of it could be. But the FDA now is trying to make the 510K process such that it does move the technology a little bit forward in the field safely. Now you notice here, as devices become more complex, they have to meet standards, and there's guidance documents on them right now on cybersecurity, et cetera, data integrity, usability engineering, that's IEC 62366-1, biocompatibility issues, et cetera. Use engineering, we mentioned that. Cybersecurity is a growing issue if your product can be networked in any way, shape, or form. It has software in it, and it can or is networked to the internet where it can be compromised. So you notice here, as maybe standards like pumps, for example. Pumps have been around for many, many decades, and yet increasingly they're becoming more sophisticated with the software capabilities, the ability to tap in remotely and things like that. That doesn't necessarily pull a pump out of a 510K category into a PMA category, but it is moving the advancement of the pumps beyond where they were 20 years ago to where they are today. And so like it brings out here for example, these older predicates may not incorporate the latest tech protections against cybersecurity threats. Older devices that rely on wireless communication will not incorporate the latest protections against interference from other technologies, crosstalk and all that. And older devices that incorporate radio frequency or laser technology may not meet the newer consensus standards adopted by the FDA. So that's the danger of using an older device as a predicate. That's why the FDA is adopting these recommendations. And you want to, the FDA is more and more saying you can use these new devices. Now there's less history, but there should be sufficient history to eliminate the problems or concerns over safety and efficacy. And you notice that the last paragraph brings out The FDA wants you to look at devices that there's clear benefits on looking at the more modern devices to demonstrate SE. And just a couple of examples here. And then the middle paragraph brings out that by these two options that we're discussing, step and breakthrough, they want the industry to move ahead a little bit. And so the patient population can have better, safer, and more effective devices, easier to use, things like that. And you notice here, they're going to sunset older predicates. They haven't done that currently, but that'll be interesting how they do that, or if they actually do that, but that's a goal that they have. So as the FDA gets more experience and history with this, we'll be getting more information either in the form of guidance documents or other statements from the agency, from their commissioner, et cetera, regarding the intent of where we should be moving with 510Ks. Now, just a statement here. Some of the statements by past commissioners are what drove STEP and breakthrough devices. So it mentions here, STEP was first outlined in April 2018, breakthrough devices in 2016. Breakthrough devices were operable at that time. The STEP was later not operable until about 2019, I believe. This is just their statement of goals that actually started driving the breakthrough program and the STEP program. So we won't spend a lot of time on this. Just be aware of this if you have a chance to go back over it. If you're actually contemplating these programs, it'll give you an idea of the areas where they want STEP to work and where they want breakthrough devices to work. So if you have a device that falls in any of those areas, you certainly want to look at the opportunities available by taking advantage of one of those programs, and then approaching the agency through what's called a Q submission program, which has a guidance document that explains that program as well. But you're reaching out to the agency before you've actually ready to file when you're in the R&D stage, advanced in the R&D stage. I mean, when the developmental stage, you want to start wiring the FDA involved if you plan on taking advantage of breakthrough or STEP, and do it through the Q sub. That's what gives them a heads up, so to speak, and then they'll start working with you in a sense like a partner. Now, my only experience has not been in STEP or breakthrough, but it has been in that one example where the FDA determined that clinicals were required. They did work with us as a partner to explain what they expected. And then when the data came back so good that it actually, they did allow us to actually cut short the extent of the phase 1 trials. We were able to keep it around 100 rather than they wanted to expand it a little bit more. So when you're getting into these kind of programs that are kind of off the grid, so to speak, they are working a little more flexibly with you. And this, my experience was before breakthrough and STEP, but now they've actually codified these as approaches you can take if you meet the criteria. So you notice if it doesn't meet breakthrough, it may meet spec. Now, STEP program is geared for safety issues that don't seriously compromise a person's health if there's problems. Breakthrough devices are dealing with technology that can affect patients' health and or life itself. So breakthrough is a higher level. STEP is a little lower level where you're showing improvements of safety or reduction in number of interventions and things like that for your device to qualify for one of those two programs. So you notice here, two pathways. Number one, new devices to treat or diagnose life-threatening or irreversible. When you hear life-threatening or irreversible, that's breakthrough. diseases or conditions that address an unmet medical need. And number two, one of the devices that treat less serious conditions and innovate on safety. Safety is a key word there, and that's STEP. So breakthrough deals with debilitating diseases or life-threatening diseases. A device that can help that, they want to see that quickly got in the market, but they still want to review it. So neither one of these programs replace the 510K or the IDE, Investigational Device Exemption, or the PMA or the de novo. You have to select one of those methods. All this does is gives the FDA a heads up. You're going to submit one of these because of life-threatening benefits or safety benefits. And so they'll expedite the review. That's all these two programs do. Expedite the review, even though you're still submitting under what you would be normally submitting, a 510K or a PMA or de novo, and so on. So that's the differentiation. And they do it by getting earlier involved in your development and understanding what you're doing, what you're coming from. They are able to make some inputs into that as well as takeaways from it to determine the approaches they want to take down the road in terms of, especially in reviewing your submission, after they have a lot of background knowledge to work with, which they didn't have in a standard submission when they don't know until a document hits their door. So we see the agile a little more. It's a process that gives the FDA a little more flexibility and knowledge beforehand, input into the stages to get to market to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the product in the marketplace. You notice here down at the bottom, last paragraph talks about sprint discussions. These are allows a little more input on the part of the FDA. Those of you that deal with the agency know they're pretty much loath to give you advice unless they have a hard document in front of them. And I can understand that because it gets into a he said, she said type of thing later on if decisions don't go along the way the submitter thought they should based on previous conversations. But with these discussions, of course, they're documented. You have a little more leeway because the FDA is seeing your thinking all the way along and are able to step in with raise issues and so on. And they actually see if they necessary certain hard copies, et cetera, to support your position and so on. So this makes them a little more of a partner, if you will, in this arrangement, but there's still the police role involved. Now, just want to mention here that the FDA also, in reviewing all of these things, has also realized there's some cases that devices have to be up classified. One example was mentioned here, automatic external defibrillators. I remember this a few years ago. They used to be class 2 devices, but they were moved to class 3. Now that meant the companies that were already selling them that had clearance under class 2, they weren't pulled from the marketplace, but they had to readdress the kind of issues that would be dealt with in class 3. And if they had questions that required clinical data and they didn't have that clinical data, although they would have had field history data, they might have to supplement that as well. But they were given a period of time in most cases to do that. It wasn't just they were stopped. If it was no longer class 2, they had to pull their product off the market and go through the PMA route before they could go back on the market. But that was probably the biggest thing I recall discussion. Metal on metal implants with the wear that caused metal fragments to float throughout the body, that kind of a thing. These are issues, and the mesh movements, etc. Even in hernia, there's been mesh problems. So you notice here some of the steps they've made under this methodology. So they're looking both ways. We're focusing on how they're trying to expand the PMA to, the 510K to accept more novel technologies, but they're also recognizing devices that have been cleared under the PMA in the past may have been prematurely cleared where they should have been done under PMA, and they're backtracking on some of those. It's not a one-way street, so to speak. So the emphasis is, again, on moving toward modern technologies to improve the device and its effect upon the patient. It also mentions that where in the past de novo was almost never heard of, now it's becoming a little more prevalent. It's kind of the in between the 510K and the PMA. It takes a PMA device that has a low safety issue, and you can go the de novo route. And then once the de novo product has been cleared or approved, then it becomes a substantially or a predicate device for future 510Ks, not de novos. So that's and I'm working with one client on that right now. So these kind of things are a desire on the part of the agency to actually show that they're listening to industry and they themselves want to improve patient outcomes. Sometimes we think of them as an unfeeling bureaucracy, but that's not the case. There's a lot of bureaucracy there, but there is in your own companies as well. And there's issues we have to deal with. That's just the nature of the beast when you get large organizations. But the senior management in FDA is desirous of accomplishing these things. As I mentioned before, there is a delay sometimes between what the senior management is driving and what the field people or the reviewers actually implement, but gradually it comes around. So let's look at a couple of these as well, the specifics, if you will. The action plan is what outlined some of these things, and that was back in 2019, excuse me. And then mentioned some of the things that needed to be considered in order to innovate, including cybersecurity issues. And the willingness to look at these things. In the past, they were more hidebound, they didn't give the appearance of wanting to change. Maybe the desire was there, but it was hard to get the bureaucracy to change. And now they're trying to put the agency into the mindset of the fact that we are changing and will continue to change. So you notice here some total life cycle. We see more and more of that. If you've been following the agency, life cycle is woven into just about everything, cradle to grave issues, as well as risk. So when we talk about safer technologies, when you think safe, think STEP. When you think serious diseases and dealing with them better, think breakthrough. So we're going to look at STEP first of all, safer technology programs or STEP programs. Basically, this is a voluntary program again, but sometimes the FDA may recommend you take this approach when you submit. But that's kind of late. But if they become aware of something, they may recommend that approach. But you should be aware of this, that if you have a product that is safer, it doesn't raise any major issues in safety and effectiveness, but actually can show that you can actually reduce risk to the patient, reduce use error, reduce follow-up procedures, and things like that. Your product may be a candidate for the STEP program. Now, as I mentioned before, that doesn't change the method of submitting a request for marketing. It still would be a 510K or a de novo or a PMA. All it does is expedite the review process of that submission because the FDA is involved early on before you submit as to what you're doing and what the issues are, and they're aware of it. So STEP deals with safety issues. Breakthrough devices deal with new technology that can more safely address serious interventions that may have serious repercussions to the patient's health or life. Notice here in the middle paragraph, they're similar to the Breakthrough Devices Program. STEP is comprised of two phases. Interested sponsors formally request inclusion in the STEP through a Q submission, and then includes the actions to expedite the development of device and prioritize review of subsequent regulatory submissions, pre-submissions, marketing submissions. You maybe put a little bit to the front of the line, so to speak, but also during the process, you'll be expedited during the review process itself. Now, I haven't seen any breakdowns onto what the actual things have transpired as they've implemented these programs. I'm sure they're tracking it, but I haven't seen that. So you notice the advantage here, you're getting interactive and communications between you and the FDA. And this is important. In the past, it hasn't always been that easiest to achieve that. And the goal is lower net time to market. So that's the advantage. You don't eliminate the need for a submission, but you have less of a review cycle, even though the FDA is involved earlier on. So they have a longer awareness of your program than they normally would. But your development is the same, but they're involved in that development early on. So they're aware of what's taking place. They're aware of the kind of issues that are going to crop up in the future. They're prepared for that, and they can review that as you progress and also make your submission, whether it be a 510K or de novo or PMA. Notice here, they'll consider the totality of evidence and the benefits. And you notice as a result of ISO 14971, 2019, instead of talking about risk benefits, the FDA has used the term that the 14971, 2019 brings out, benefit risk. Little minor point. Okay, that mentions a STEP. STEP is designed for new safety innovations. Breakthrough devices is what its term implies. New technology, not radically new, but new enough that actually reduces the danger to the patient in terms of irreversible disease issues or injury issues and or death. And so that's the key point. And here again, you see the two phases in the bottom paragraph. The designation request phase, in which an interested sponsor of a device requests the FDA grant that device breakthrough device designation. That's under Q sub. And then the second phase encompasses actions to expedite development of the device and prioritized review of subsequent regulatory submissions. It might be a pre-submission, but certainly the 510K, PMA, or de novo. So you notice here, some of the things that be subject matter to discuss with the agency. Changes is a big issue with the FDA. That's why design control was implemented in the mid-90s, 820.30. The desire to capture changes because the FDA recognized that in the development phase, R&D was very loosely controlled. Usually the engineer, there was R&D engineer, could make changes on the fly to solve one problem, and without knowing it, might introduce other problems that wouldn't be found until it got in the field and caused injury or death. So as a result of that, design control was implemented to implement a moderate level of control over changes during the design process without stifling creativity. But you notice here, breakthrough devices still have to meet the requirements for a device of safety and efficacy. So it's no shortcut on that. The shortcuts come from FDA being informed beforehand, knowing what's coming, expediting the review process, maybe even putting you a little more ahead of the line if it has a serious impact on the patient safety if it's implemented, positive patient safety. And you notice here in the last bullet point or last paragraph, also they'll be wired in on a post-market surveillance, if you will. Now, in the second paragraph, the FDA may accept a greater extent of uncertainty of the benefit risk profile for these devices if appropriate. That's based on knowing a lot more about how it was developed, how it was reviewed, how it was tested, challenged, etc. And they will not reduce the benefit risk category for that product just because it's breakthrough technology. But you notice here it gets a priority review placed at the top of the queue. So And then additional review sources are employed if necessary. But the second bullet point, or key point that I see neglected many times with smaller companies or startup companies, the device must be in conformance with the QS reg, that's 21 CFR 820, or the CGMPs for devices. Now it says you have to submit it in a PMA. They might even do a pre-inspection of you, but not with a 510K. The assumption is you are in compliance. And as I said before, many times the consultants called in because after the fact, they weren't in compliance. They didn't have a design history file. That's one of the biggest failings right there, or a risk management file under 14971. So the goal, basically, breakthrough technologies are involved, a more effective treatment or diagnosis of life-threatening or irreversibly debilitating human disease conditions. Breakthrough is life-threatening or irreversible debilitating human disease. STEP is safety, improved safety. So the key differences between the two. And then when they, like it brings out here, they'll consider whether you're applying with PMA, de novo, or 510K. In other words, they have a little more concern with a 510K because there's less challenge to safety and effectiveness than there would be in a de novo, and the most, of course, would be with the PMA with the large number of clinicals involved. So you have to indicate which approach you are planning on taking, and that will determine a little bit about what kind of leeways they give you and what things they will do or recommend. And then you start with the request with a Q sub, as that last paragraph brings out. So they have sprint discussions. This is one of the advantages of getting into this program throughout the development phase. So you know what's coming up in the future, and they know what's coming up in the future, and you don't have a lot of questions. You can have a data development plan to provide a kind of a step-by-step approach that you're going to be taking, and they can kind of review that as well and maybe make suggestions off of that. And of course, frequent updates. Some references. So very briefly, we'll sum up this discussion with the 510K. Typical, the traditional is a full 25 elements. Abbreviated is where you're tying your submission to certification that you're developing this and testing it to applicable ISO standards, EN standards, that kind of a thing. IEC standards and guidance documents. A special is basically where you're making changes to the device. Some of you are familiar with the fact if you change your device, each time you make a change, you have to analyze the change against the previous 510K to see if you need to submit a new 510K. Or if you have a cumulative series of changes, you have to look at the individual change and the cumulative number to determine whether a new 510K is required. Special is when the new 510K is filed, it would be more than likely a special. So you have the user fee cover sheet, you have the pre-market review cover sheet, you have a cover letter, you have an indications for use statement, the point I mentioned earlier, it's a tab. You have a summary or a statement that I recommend the summary, where you briefly include everything in a specified format that is available under freedom of information for somebody else to see, a competitor to see, as to what your basic elements of your 510K deal with. A statement is basically the effect if a customer requested under, a client requested under freedom of information, you have to supply it. And to me, that's more onerous than just applying the summary. A truthful and accuracy statement regarding the information submitted or omitted. Whether it's class 3 or not, it would not be in most cases, very rarely. Financial certification if clinicals are involved, disclosure. Declaration of conformity to existing standards, etc. Executive summary that breaks down the whole submission into a more brief discussion. Device description, including drawings and photos, etc. tying into your predicate devices under a substantial equivalent discussion, your labeling, and that includes your instructions for use, even some of your web advertising and marketing advertising as well. All that's considered labeling. Sterilization and shelf life, if it's sterile product, then accelerated aging would be under shelf life with a start onto real-time aging. Biocompatibility, if it's touching tissue or entering the body. Software or firmware, and that requires adherence to a guidance document with 11 elements in it, which are being changed down to 10 where the draft sits out. Electromagnetic compatibility or electrical issues, performance testing bench, performance testing animal, and performance testing clinical if that's involved, and then appendix information. It is assumed your products were built under the CGMPs for the final testing, as well as what's being shipped out to the customer after you get a clearance. Many times that is not the case with small companies. They aren't aware of it or choose to ignore it, but the FDA assumes when you file a 510K that the products that have been tested to meet the requirements of standards are built under the CGMPs, and the products shipped to the patient or doctors or the field are built under the CGMPs. As I mentioned, the FDA says 90 days to review, but it actually drags out to about 120 in most cases. Sometimes, rarely, it comes in under that, and it can exceed that as well. And if you have clinicals, it's longer than that as well. You can't split predicates, the last bullet point down here. You used to be able to do that. Several different predicate devices to combine products, not a combination product, but combine technologies into one device from two separate predicates. Now, bear in mind your 510K and your design control information is all part of your company's intellectual property, and it can be sold when you sell a company or sell a product line, etc. The FDA doesn't track who has the 510K. You track that. That was one of the recommendations, but it never has been accomplished on the part of the FDA. So you can buy a 510K. Incidentally, when you compare your product for changes against the 510K, it has to be your 510K. As we mentioned, device changes, you have to record this information and record the analysis against the two the old K97 replaced by the two guidance documents on modifications and whether or not a 510K is required of a device and or a device with software. So that concludes my portion of this discussion. We'd like to open this up to some Q&A. I'd like to direct your attention back to perhaps Amy. She might have some information here. Let me check the chat panel. See if there's anything here.
Great presentation, John. Absolutely. We do have a couple of questions so far. Let's see. The first one is, if a 510K is approved for direct to consumer, what type of submission would be required to sell at any retail store?
You're talking about OTC products. Usually OTC is a result of a 510K that was originally a prescription where a doctor's involved. The FDA views a prescription 510K, which is the majority of them, as a safer situation because you have a human expert to be the interface between the patient and device. So when you go OTC, now you're dealing with elimination of that interface, the physician, and the patient is the direct one user of the product who may not be overly familiar with the product, may not have been trained on it, and it may require some of that. So they would be looking at your 510K a little more stringently to make sure that the instructions for use and the user interface under use engineering / human factors addresses that issue. So that would be a requirement. Now, as far as sale at retail stores, I can't answer that question. I know Amazon is concerned with these issues. Walmart is concerned with these issues. Your various drug chains like Walgreens and CVS, they deal with these issues as well. And they would be authorized under a product that has an OTC clearance on the part of the FDA. Now, if you switch to OTC, I have never done this, but I believe you would have to file a new 510K. What I can do is I'll double check this. I'll send the answer to Amy and she'll try to get it out to you in attendance.
Sure,
And that'll be
absolutely.
true of any others. And she agreed to that. Okay.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
Great. Our second question is, what are some examples of special controls?
Well, the name implies that general controls are the GMPs. Special controls, what they might say, this standard is applicable, maybe an electrical standard or EN 60601, for example, for electrical products, ground fault testing, so on. Those would be special controls, and others that the FDA might specifically call out. These would be listed in the regulation number, the 800 series number that applies to your product. If it's not there, then you will have to deal with that under the PMA program. And just electronic submissions through the FDA portal. I've done them, and more you have to do them. In the past, it used to be kind of voluntary. Now it's mandatory. The FDA has guidance documents as to the format you have to put them in. They even have a program that will actually pre-test it. You can run the file through their program to see if it's acceptable, if it meets the requirements before you actually send it off to them. So you can do that. So I'd recommend you check with the FDA's website to, if you're planning on doing a 510K, because you will have to have an electronic submission, an eSub on that.
Right. And also for those who are interested in the submission but would prefer a third party to submit on your behalf, EAS also provides that service of electronic submissions. So we have another question, and I think we really have time for one more because we're a little over time.
Okay.
But for biologic device combination products, what pathway is prevalent in your experience?
I don't get involved in a lot of these, but it'd be the 510K program. When you're dealing with something like that, you're dealing with a combination product. You're dealing with a 21 CFR 4. 21 CFR 4 basically is a tie-in document, which basically says you develop an operating CGMP system based on your most risky element in that combination, which in this case would be biologics. So you'd be under the biologic CGMPs for your operating system for your manufacturing, with the one exception. You'd have to add into that biologic GMPs the device design control GMP 820.30. Same with drug device combination. If the drug is the highest risk product, your operating system would be the drug GMPs 210, 211, but then you'd have to also include the device design control requirements of 820.30. That's what 4 tells you. You just combine elements of the GMPs with the dominant GMP being the one dealing with the highest risk component of your combination product. So, and then that would have to be discussed in your submission, in the 510K. So I see more and more does open up to the 510K approach, especially as this technology becomes more familiar to the reviewers, the FDA. It would actually depend on your device and what biologics are involved there.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks everyone so much for joining us today. And thank you, John, for another great presentation. When I send the post-webinar wrap up, I'll be sure to include, in case you weren't able to join us for John's previous webinar on device risk management, I'll send a link to that as well as the recorded version of this one on the website. So John, thanks so much. And anyone with questions on 510K devices or interest in EAS helping with your 510K, we would be glad to do so. So thanks so much all, and thanks John, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you all, and thank you, Amy.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye.